In the next set of videos, we're going to talk about the static mesh pipeline. We're going to be using Maya as the example program, and I'm going to show you how to take this simple mesh and export it from Maya, and we're going to import it into Unreal. Okay, so the first thing we want to make sure when we have a mesh that we're ready to export into Unreal, we want to make sure that the pivot point is exactly where we want it to be. Sometimes you may want the pivot point in the center of the object. In this case, I'm going to take the pivot point and I'm going to place it at 0, 0, 0 on the grid in world space. It's very important to understand where your pivot point is in relation to the object and where you're building your objects in Unreal. This is vital because you don't want to put this in Unreal and realize that the pivot point's in the wrong place. The next thing you want to do is triangulate your mesh. This is really important because if you don't triangulate your mesh, it'll be triangulated for you automatically. Now, most of the time that's perfectly fine, but sometimes that can create unexpected results. So triangulating your mesh in Maya first is a good idea. I'm going to undo that and worry about triangulating at the end when I'm finished ready to export this thing out. So I'm going to go to the UV texture editor and I'm going to look at my UVs. Now this object has two sets of UVs. It's got UVs for the diffuse map and the texturing and all that, and it has a second set of UVs which I've called light map, and those are my light map UVs. And if you're not familiar with what light map UVs are, don't worry about it right now. It's not that important. The main idea here is that I want to show you that you can have an object with multiple UV sets and we can export those UV sets into Unreal. So the next thing I'm going to look at is material creation and how that works between Maya and Unreal. Unreal through FBX supports many different shaders in Maya, so like the blend shader, the Phong shader, the Lambert shader, and a few others. So the actual shading model is not supported, so if you export out a Lambert or a blend, it's pretty much going to be the same in Unreal. So I'm just going to create a brand new blend shader. And first let's apply it to the object, so I'll just middle mouse button drag that on top of the box object. Let's go ahead and look at the material attributes. So if I go over here in the attribute editor, we can see here's my blend 1. One of the cool things about Unreal is that whatever we name our material in Maya, that name will actually be transferred over to our material inside of Unreal, which is pretty cool because it means that you don't have to worry about importing materials and then having to rename them and all that stuff, which can be a little bit of a waste of time. I like to move pretty quickly in production, so I'll call this UE4 CubeMaster _ mat, which is short for material, and that name will actually transfer over to Unreal. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in a diffuse map into the color. So the color attribute is where you want to plug in a diffuse map. I'm going to go to File and just pick up a quick sample diffuse map that I created pretty quickly, just for demonstration purposes. So it's this checkerboard black texture. Go ahead and hit 6 on the keyboard to go to a textured view so we can see the texture. Now the texture looks a little bit funny on the object right now. We're going to fix that in a moment. I'm going to go to the bump mapping slot and I'm going to apply normal map. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my normal map. And another cool thing about the Unreal FBX pipeline is that if you have a texture plugged into the color slot and a texture plugged into the normal map slot, both of those textures will automatically move over to Unreal. What I'm doing is increasing the tiling on the UVs. Now that information is not going to transfer over to Unreal, unfortunately, but I'm doing it mainly for my purposes so that I can look at this object in Maya and get a good idea of how it's going to look in Unreal. So we can see the normal map there. If I switch over to viewport 2.0, I can see everything is mapped correctly and all that stuff. So right now I have my blend material with a texture plugged into the color slot and a normal map plugged into the bump mapping slot. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the name of the material. I'm going to call this checker black. The reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to show you an example of adding multiple materials. The FBX Unreal pipeline supports the application of multiple materials to an object. So if you have a character who uses a material for, say, their military gear, a different material for their skin and their head and their hair, you can actually apply multiple materials to a single object. So in this case, I'm going to apply a new material to the polygons on the top of the object. So all I'll do is create a second blend material. I'll apply it to the mesh, and then I'm going to go ahead and rename this. So I'm going to call this one checker red underscore matte. And now I'm going to do the same thing as before. I'll just go ahead and apply a red version of my checkerboard texture. I'm going to adjust the tiling on the UVs. Again, the tiling's not going to transfer over to Unreal. I'm just doing that so that I can see this in my Maya viewport. So again, just to reiterate, things that will transfer over to Unreal are the texture assignments, the normal map assignments, the material names will also transfer over, so that's extremely useful. Okay, so that pretty much takes care of materials. So now we're going to look at creating collision for our object. So collision is extremely important. I'm going to create basically a box that surrounds this object. And for the beginners out there, the reason collision is so important is because if your floor in your game doesn't have any collision, when the player starts your game, they're just going to fall right through the floor and keep falling down out of the world. And that's a progression blocker. That'll actually break the game. Same thing for walls. You want to make sure you have collision on walls if they're meant to have collision, or meant to stop the player if they try to walk through the walls. So I'll create a simple cube, and this part's really important. The naming convention is vital when creating collision. So you can't just create a cube and expect the collision to work. The trick is the naming. What you have to do is you have to name the collision object with the same name as your main mesh. So whatever your object is called, in this case it's called UE4 Cube Master, my collision object has to be called UE4 Cube Master as well, with one exception. You have to make sure that you put a prefix before the name. Now for a box piece of collision like this, the prefix should be UBX underscore and the name of the object. However, if you're using a convex piece of collision, you're going to have to call it UCX underscore and then the name of the object. If you're confused and you don't know which one you should use, then as a rule of thumb, use UCX underscore and then the name of the object. So if your names don't match up, or you misspell it, or you forget the underscore after the UCX or whatever, collision is not going to work. So now let me show you in the next video about the LOD system and how we can transfer or export LODs over from Maya to Unreal.